Indiana Lawmakers is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by the Indy Chamber, working to unite business and community to maintain a strong economy and quality of life.
Indiana Lawmakers, from the State House to your house. Mention the use of chairs and whips to maintain order, and you may well evoke thoughts of old-school lion tamers. The State House, of course, isn't a circus, but when it comes to that multi-ring spectacle known as the Indiana General Assembly, the animal handler imagery is not without metaphorical value. After all, the General Assembly is made up of 150 strong-willed characters, each with a distinct agenda, persona, and constituency. Without a clearly defined leadership structure, chaos would almost certainly reign. In the House of Representatives, the undisputed ringmaster is the Speaker. Every 2 years after Indiana's legislative elections, House members choose one of their own to occupy this all-important post. Besides serving as the de facto leader of the majority caucus, the Speaker is the presiding officer of the House, meaning they manage the chamber's formal proceedings. The Speaker also decides the makeup of legislative committees, appoints the chairs of those committees, and determines which committees will consider which bills. On the other side of the State House rotunda, the Senate doesn't have a Speaker per se, but it does have a largely equivalent leadership position, President Pro Tem. Technically, the Lieutenant Governor is the President or presiding officer of the Senate, but because they aren't an elected member of the chamber, the Lieutenant Governor votes only to break ties. The President Pro Tem presides when the Lieutenant Governor is away. Pro Tem, of course, is a Latin phrase meaning for the time being. But make no mistake, in every sense that matters, the Senate's President Pro Tem calls the shots, assigning bills, appointing committees, and setting the chamber's overall agenda. While the majority caucuses are electing their leaders, their partisan counterparts are doing likewise. Enter the House and Senate minority leaders. Although they lack the broad administrative powers wielded by the Speaker and President Pro Tem, the minority leaders provide opposition to the majority party's policies. Oh yeah, let's not forget the majority and minority whips, along with their assistant whips. And generally speaking, the whips are enforcers. They pressure their caucus's members to toe the party line. The term derives from British fox hunting, where a so-called whipper-in is responsible for keeping the hounds from wandering away from the pack. See, there's just no getting around that animal handler imagery. Longtime viewers will know that we typically kick off each season of Indiana Lawmakers by sitting down with the top leaders of the General Assembly. We're starting this season with a special two-part leadership conversation. I am pleased to welcome House Speaker Todd Huston, a Fishers Republican, House Minority Leader Phil GiaQuinta, a Fort Wayne Democrat, Senate President Pro Tem Rodric Bray, a Martinsville Republican, and Senate Minority Leader Shelli Yoder, a Bloomington Democrat. Thank you all for being here. That'll teach you to say that we didn't give you enough time in the past. Be careful, you might be a three-show
I'm not sure
special.
I remember saying that, John.
Well, we probably have it on paper, in the tape somewhere. We'll look it up later. There are going to be more than 1,000 bills, in all likelihood, that are introduced this session. And as I mentioned in the open, it's a dizzying array of topics that daunting, historic, unprecedented, pick your adjective. The one thing, though, that you and your members have to do, of course, is craft a two-year state budget. That's sort of everything else, in a way, is optional. Now, I know that usually comes together like at 11:59 on the day of sine die in April 29th, if we go that long. You have an agenda, and I'm looking, for those listening on radio, I'm looking at House Republicans. You all have an agenda. Senate Republicans have an agenda. And Mike Braun, the guy who's now occupying the governor's office, has an agenda. Take me to that conference committee when the differences are being worked out in that last 11th hour session. How contentious, Todd Huston, will that be with these competing agendas in terms of the budget?
Well, first of all, if it's coming together at 11 o'clock on the last day of session, we've got a lot of concerns. Not that contentious.
I've seen a few.
Yeah, not recently, though. I think it won't be that contentious. So first of all, great working relationships between Senator Bray and myself, Chairman Thompson and Chairman Mishler. We look forward to working with Governor-elect Braun and his team. And, you just kind of work through. You're right, we each have different priorities, but most of the time those priorities align, and then you work together. And what we always start with is the foundation, which is we are gonna spend less than we take in, and we're gonna have a structurally sound, honest budget. And then you just have to prioritize resources, and we just kind of work together to figure out among the group to say what are those things that are most important to us, and how do we prioritize resources. And obviously, half the budget's in K-12, so that's always going to be a big topic of conversation. But then, looking across agencies and initiatives, you just kind of work it out together. And I feel really blessed that we have a group of people across the administration and across the two chambers that get along and work together on it.
Rod Bray, that sounds pretty optimistic. I looked at a comment you made here in reference to the budget and the negotiations, and you said, well, one of the challenges is that everything the state does is, and I think you used the word, exorbitantly more expensive. Right. Did I quote you directly?
Yeah, that's
more
close.
Expensive than it was even a year ago. That's a complicating factor. Are you as optimistic as your counterpart in the House?
Well, I'm optimistic about the process for sure. I mean, over the last few years when we worked on budgets, the Speaker's team, my team, and the Governor's team have all worked together. We found it very effective to communicate not just on the last day of the legislative session, but already they've been talking about what those priorities are. And sure, there's differences of opinion. Some of them are simply nuanced, but that communication really does help grease the wheel and make progress on it. Without a doubt, this year's budget is going to be challenging. If you looked at the December forecast, there's a little bit of new money in the first year. The second year is very complicated.
About $700 million in the first year,
something
and it
like that,
shrinks to maybe $70 million, which essentially
nothing.
is almost nothing.
Yeah, almost nothing.
Who would have ever thought we'd say $70 million is almost nothing? But your point is well taken.
But that's based on the size of our budget. That's what that feels like. And so, without a doubt, there's going to be challenges there, and we're going to have some difficult decisions to make. But as the Speaker said, we work pretty smoothly together. Governor-elect Braun is putting together an effective team. They are trying to learn as they go and trying to put their first budget together. But, we're going to base it, obviously, on the December forecast, and we're not going to spend more than we take in any way, shape, or form. We'll reform that when we look at the April forecast, and we'll be able to tweak that a little bit. And we'll land on what those priorities are in due time.
And you read my mind about the April forecast, and that's, I hope I didn't offend you when I was talking about the 11th hour negotiations, but let's call them the 8th or 9th hour, because really we won't know for sure until that updated revenue forecast in mid-April. Is that a fair assessment, do you think, Shelli Yoder?
That is a fair assessment, and I think how you opened this segment was talking about how everything costs more money, and I know Hoosiers across the state are saying the same thing. In their family budgets, things cost more money, and it will be imperative, and I know that the Indiana Senate Democrats are focused on making sure that we keep that in mind when we're talking about these cuts that we need to make to health care and to education and to every aspect of this budget. In balancing a budget, that we keep in mind how they impact families across the state. That's going to be first and foremost on the minds of Senate Democratic Caucus.
And I'm guessing some Hoosiers that aren't a Kelley School of Business lecturer at IU, as you are, could still read the tea leaves in terms of what they're paying at the grocery store and at the gas pump.
That's absolutely right, and they're feeling it.
Phil GiaQuinta, again, what are we going to look at the tea leaves, the crystal ball, take me to the end of the session? Are you going to be saying, okay, that budget worked out? Or are you going to say, boy, we missed an opportunity?
Well, I will say that we do get updates monthly, so it doesn't just have to be the April forecast, obviously, that something that has guided us in the past. But we do get monthly updates, and we can take a look and see what March is going to tell us as well. So, yeah, your first question is, what's the working relationship going to be between the leaders and the new governor? It's going to be interesting. He's one of us, comes from the House, and going to be the first time that happened in a long time. And I think he, understands, how the process works. And I take some comfort in knowing that he was a school board member, so he understands public education, the importance of public education. Former Democrat, too. That gives me some hope as well.
You just described everything about Todd Huston except the Democrat part. The school board, yes. The House of Representatives, yes. Maybe that's the future for you. I don't know.
Still have hope in the Speaker, too. No, look, we feel like we've got a great team And I will say that when I'm talking with Representative Porter in the past, he's worked well with Chairman Thompson, and so we'll just continue to try to work hard and do the best we can. Senator Yoder mentioned though that we do need to keep Hoosiers in mind. I talked a lot yesterday with regards to the session and the rising costs that affecting all Hoosiers, and I think our number one priority should be, what can we do to make Indiana a more affordable place for Hoosiers. And
you mentioned Representative Thompson. For those who are keeping score, certainly chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, where the budget will start. And I'm sure there will also be references perhaps to the counterpart in the Senate, Ryan Mishler, and his committee, Senate Appropriations, just to sort of talk about the process for one more moment. All right, overview done. Let's talk about some of the imperatives and challenges that are competing for a piece of that budgetary pie. You mentioned, Todd, Huston, that K-12 education is still, well, it used to be more than half. Now, because of other factors, which I'm guessing we'll talk about, it's not quite half, but still, it's the lion's share. $9+ billion. And that's a lot of money. Even if $70 million wasn't, $9 billion is. I mean, the past few budget sessions, people have come away and saying, we're pleased to say that we gave historic increases to basic tuition support to K-12 public schools. Is that possible this year to get an actual increase?
They're going to get more money. I mean, I would anticipate there will be more money in the K-12 formula.
Well,
we'll increase over $9 billion.
Are you factoring in private schools and vouchers and whatever?
We fund kids, John. I mean, at the end of the day, in Indiana, we fund students, and that $9 billion that we spend in K-12 education funds students. And I would suspect, I deal with the top line numbers, the numbers that that we spend on an annual basis, and that number will go up. I'm pretty confident, unless we get a different April forecast, that number will go up, and it will be an increase for those schools that educate kids. Per pupil will be up.
I get the top line, certainly, but just so for sake of comparison, again, will we see the traditional tuition support, traditional public schools, I'm talking about those that are run by locally elected school boards, not charter schools, not vouchers, not schools that enroll students with vouchers. Will that guaranteed be an increase?
Well, John, I think that, in fairness, I'm not sure I agree with the question, because at the end of the day, I mean, we fund students. So if a school has more students than they did the year before, yes, they'll have more money. If they have fewer students, they could potentially have less. We fund students. There'll be more money put into the school funding formula. That's this year. As I sit here today, I feel confident about that. Maybe, God forbid, we don't have a very good April revenue forecast, but the fact of the matter is yes, there will be more money in the student funding formula that funds the a little more than 1 million students across the state of Indiana.
Well, I'm glad I introduced Ryan Mishler a moment ago for sake of discussion, because he might be relevant to this question that I'll ask you. Last year, he said let's stop with all these these programs. The vouchers have various names. There's this scholarship program. Let's just let the dollars follow the student. Everybody K through 21, or basically gets a pot of money to use with as you see fit for education expenses. Based on what I just heard Todd Huston say, that's a Mishler model, if I may. Am I misreading that?
Well, I mean, it's an Indiana model. We've been doing that for a long time, where the dollar follows the student, and I think your question...
But not in that formal a fashion where you basically structure a whole program in that way.
Well, but I mean, if a student is going to go to a public school and he or she switches from that public school to the next public school, the dollars are going to follow that child to the next public school. If the child goes then to a charter school, the money is going to leave that public school and go to the charter school. And if they go to a private school that accepts vouchers, it'll go there. I mean, that's how that works. To your question about, are we going to have more historic increases? I don't know that for education overall, I don't know that I have the answer for that at this point, because we have to see how those numbers fall. But to your point, in 2019, I think we added $763 million new dollars to education. The 2021 budget, $1.1 billion, and then in the 23 budget, it was more like $1.5 billion of new money to the public education system. So we are absolutely investing in that. It's the most important thing that the state does, and that is reflected in the fact that it's far and away the largest budget item that we have. But there are other things that are going to be pulling at that, and other challenges that we have that we're going to have to contend with, and we can maybe talk about it a little bit, but Medicaid is one of those things that's trying to trying to take over a large chunk of the budget. We're trying to make sure that that doesn't happen, so we have money to spend on our children.
And in fact, we'll get to that. That's one of your top 5 or 6 bills that you've already outlined. Shelli, Yoder, this notion, though, of the overall, pay attention to the top line for students, does that sit well with your caucus?
Well, I heard Speaker Huston, and we hear this a lot, we fund students. But I'd like to put a little twist on that, or clarify that. Actually, we are responsible for stewarding that Hoosier taxpayers are funding this, and we are stewards of that money. And 90% of Hoosier parents' kiddos are sent to public schools. And so if we are being good stewards, and the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus is going to be focused on making sure that we are stewards of the Hoosier taxpayer dollar. And if that many students are going to our public schools, we need to make sure that that investment is focused on our traditional public schools. And additionally, if we're going to increase funding to those students going to private schools, we need to take a hard look at how we're going to fund pre-K, because if we're going to talk about the best investment, the return on investment for pre-K and early education, early childhood education, that's where the state and Hoosier taxpayers are going to get the best ROI.
Well, Phil GiaQuinta, she just talked about a message, a drumbeat that you've been sounding probably as long as you've been in your role, which is the notion kids get them in the classroom earlier. Forget 7 as the mandatory start date. 6 would be better. Let's, even though there's a pilot, well, I guess it's not a pilot program when it's statewide. With pre-K, it's not funded. Is that where the money should be, the focus should be? And how optimistic are you that will see any growth this session?
Yeah. Well, as Representatives Porter and Delaney have pointed out as well, that when we talk about the funding that we've seen for education, including vouchers and charters, over the last 10 years, it has not kept up with the funding for the previous 10 years. And what has that resulted in? Districts that have had to go around the tax cap, so they've had to pass referendum, which means an increase in property taxes. So we could have kept property taxes even lower if we would have been funding education at appropriate, in my opinion, at an appropriate level, frankly, to mirror how we did it for the previous 10 years. When you talk about pre-K, right now, I don't think you can qualify for any sort of pre-K if you make over $46,000 roughly in there. And we're talking about now expanding the voucher program, where you can make up toward, we're going to kind of blow the lid off the thing and
400% of
make $1 million or whatever the number is going to, whatever the amount will be that you'll be able to qualify to go to parochial. And just pre-K, I mean, that's, when we talk about how we want to really invest in students, if we want to invest in students going forward, we need to start at the pre-K level. We don't have a robust pre-K program like we should have in this state, and all studies from Purdue and others have shown that a really robust pre-K program where you're getting kids in early, they'll do so much better in 3rd grade and on.
Can I talk a little bit about that pre-K program?
Sure.
I've looked at a lot of those studies, and I've read them closely. And I don't quite understand the studies and the way they show it, because it is intuitive to me that if you start a child earlier, then they'll do a little bit better. But when you read these studies, most of them show, of course, that there's a fade where the kids that don't go to preschool finally catch up to those children. Most of those studies show that fade happens the 2nd semester of their kindergarten year. And there's almost no evidence that academically kids do better by going to pre-K. I don't begin to understand that, but that's what the studies show. And in fact, there's a study out of Vanderbilt that had about 3,000 kids in it. They followed them from pre-K through their college years. And in fact, the kids that went to pre-K were less successful than the ones that didn't. I don't understand why that is. It's very curious, but I think we just need to take a very hard look at that before we invest millions and millions or billions of dollars of the state's money into that to make sure that we're getting the bang for our buck.
Well, schools, regardless of grade level, have relied heavily in recent years on referenda to generate additional funds to make up for gaps or to pursue programs. There is a push in the General Assembly as part of the overall property tax relief push to maybe make it more difficult for schools to ring that cash register, whether it's requiring referenda to be during general elections, et cetera, et cetera. Should schools be alarmed that that sort of relief or safety valve may be narrowing for them in terms of referenda?
No, look, I think there are a lot of us that believe that those referendums should be in the general election.
When people
the even
arguably
number
are
of
paying
years
attention.
when people are actually voting at larger numbers. I don't think I haven't seen any proposals that say we're going to take away referendums. Just put them at times in which the voters there's a large propensity of people going to vote.
And then this notion of property tax relief, that's certainly one of Mike Braun's. He ran on that. That's going to be front and center. And that's front and center in the Senate Republican plan, several of the bills. Are alarm bells going off on the Democratic side of the aisle about school referenda or other sorts of, whether it's schools or local governments that might feel the squeeze and have to rely on their own built-in taxing capacity in terms of their income tax abilities to tax? Should they be alarmed? Are you alarmed?
I know that the Senate Democratic Caucus is listening to Hoosiers, and we are hearing from them that property taxes are becoming more and more challenging, especially for particular populations, vulnerable populations, older adults on fixed incomes, our veterans. We could even say our farmers, the way that their land is appraised and how they pay property taxes.
But what can you do to help them? I mean, if
absolutely.
everybody
I think
acknowledges
what's
the
really
problem.
important is that we can take a very close and careful look at the way that property taxes are created and make sure that those who need the help, we can get them the help, but not put an extra burden on the very people that are already crying out. Because we have heard from economists throughout the state saying that the current plan could put an extra burden, just reallocating those dollars elsewhere, and those communities, our rural communities and our urban communities, are going to suffer the most. It's going to be a very difficult conversation, but the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus is very aware that we need to be talking about property taxes, but how we do it, that's going to be the important conversation.
Of course, the General Assembly created a task force that looked at the issue of overall tax policy for 2 years, came up with some suggestions that may or may not be incorporated into what we see this session. How do you give relief without squeezing locals?
Good question, and it's kind of a little complicated. When it comes to, and obviously, I think probably 75% of most city budgets are directed toward police and fire, and so we, don't want to make sure that we're not hurting local government and with their jobs they have to do to make sure keep their communities safe. We've seen rising valuations. Maybe we need to. We've talked, or Speaker Huston and I've talked about we need more housing. We have. Are there ways to incentivize folks to go in and look into communities where we used to have blighted areas. We tore down old houses. Now we have vacant lots. We just need more housing. I think would help and lower the housing costs that way as well. So.
Sounds like another budget item, though.
I understand that, but it all relates to you were talking about property taxes
right.
too, and I think, frankly, if we're going to do anything with regards to property taxes, we should for sure give relief to those folks that are 65 and older.
That's more important to me all the time. Not yet, but it's going to be very important eventually.
Me too.
No discussion about dollars and cents and the fiscal policy would be complete this session, especially about Medicaid, which one of you mentioned a moment ago. That is the fastest growing part of the budget. And it was complicated by a miscalculation last year of $1 billion about how much the state's tab would be. And there have been efforts to fix that. Todd Huston, now your budget priorities formal have not come out, and I know that your colleague here on the Senate side, that is one of his formal priorities, but are you basically going to sign on to?
Two things, John. I just want to go back to the property tax conversation real quick, because I do want to say that people have to remind themselves the state of Indiana gets $0 from property taxes. So this is all about the local units of government. And we have a part to play in this, but they have the ultimate responsibility. And we'll be, we're completely conscious of that. They're the ones that deliver the services, but it's the money is collected at the local level, it stays at the local level. We're going to have to find the right balance on all that. On Medicaid, look, we have like every state, this is a huge challenge. I mean, that section, that portion of the budget grows astronomically faster than any revenue source that can come in to replace it. So, I think Senator Mishler, Chairman Thompson, and a bunch of others are looking at how do we put the appropriate guardrails. We understand, and it's incredibly important to us, these folks, many of these people are the most vulnerable in society. And we need to walk the path to make sure they have the supports that they're needed. But we need to support the folks that actually need this and who actually, and provide them the services that are actually necessary.
Well, Rob Bray, again, these are some of the bills that are your caucus priorities, and you basically limit it to 500,000, the number of people on the Healthy Indiana plan. I think there are now 680,000 people. They'd have to find insurance elsewhere. Also, a 36-month lifetime cap in terms of the benefits and participation in the program. Palatable, and is that going to work?
Well, there's some difficult decisions there, but keep in mind, again, to the idea that this is the fastest growing item in the budget. In the 23 budget, it went from 16% of the budget to 19% of the budget, and that was before we realized there was a $984 million missed part of the forecast. So it is, so it's astronomically faster growing than anything else that we have, and so we've got to make sure that we preserve it for the people that need it, but we also need to preserve those state dollars for other things like public education, as we discussed. So I think what you'll see is when you talk about getting people off that program, the Healthy Indiana plan is income-based. And if people grow out of that and have a higher income, they need to be taken off that program. So we need to make sure we execute it with fidelity.
All right. Believe it or not, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there for now. But as I noted at the outset of our discussion, you can tune in next week for a continuation of my conversation with the General Assembly's top leaders on the next Indiana Lawmakers. And time now for our weekly conversation with Ed Feigenbaum, publisher of the newsletter Indiana Legislative Insight, part of Hannah News Service. The new governor, Mike Braun, what would he have thought about the conversation and the positions outlined by leaders in the General Assembly?
I'm not going to speak for our new governor, John. I've been through, you and I have been through and reported on 8 different governors now over the decades, and he will be another one. And there will be more after him, and there will be more people reporting after us. But what's interesting about Governor Braun is that he will come in having been a member of the House, as Leader GiaQuinta pointed out. He'll be the first former House member who served as governor since Otis Bowen. We did have another legislator, Frank O'Bannon, who had been a state senator. But he'll come in with an understanding of the process. But at the same time, he's a businessman who ran a business and was very unhappy as a legislator in both the Indiana House and in the U.S. Senate. He wants to lead, and it's going to be a fun process to watch to see to what extent the legislature works with him when he might think that they work for him.
Interesting point. Well, let me ask you a question, a version of what I asked them. Let's look into the future, 4 months from now, that final budget negotiations and conference committee. How contentious will it be, given what you just said about the
Everything's going to focus on Medicaid. They've got to cut Medicaid to meet budget. Medicaid. All right, Ed, as always, appreciate your insight. Thank you, John.
Well, that concludes another edition of Indiana Lawmakers. Until next week, take care.
Indiana Lawmakers is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by the Indy Chamber, working to unite business and community to maintain a strong economy and quality of life.